Hello and welcome to this Monday's weekly market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, Israel launches strikes into Lebanon, as well as that Jackson Hole bankers pivot to cuts as soft landing comes into view. And finally, Kamala Harris's election fundraising surges past $500 million since replacing Joe Biden. We've got lots to talk about on the charts. Also, with lots happening on the economic calendar, but we'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around soon to see that. Before we get straight into it though, make sure you subscribe. The first article to talk about is obviously to do with war in the Middle East, with Israel now launching strikes into Lebanon. The Israeli military has now launched a new wave of missiles and airstrikes into southern Lebanon during the early hours of Sunday morning. This comes in what they are describing as an attempt to prevent and destroy an extensive attack by Hezbollah, which was in the early stages. Now, of course, this has been something that we've kind of been speaking about for quite some time now, and it's been something that's kind of been, the fears of it have been growing and growing really ever since the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. And since then, of course, we've seen the Israeli war in Gaza, and we've seen the ramifications of that, with one of the key ramifications, of course, being the kind of outcry from specific Iranian proxy groups in the Middle East. One of them, of course, being Hezbollah, but others being the Houthis, which of course recently struck a kind of commercial merchant vessel ship in the Red Sea, destroying that oil tanker and causing a very large explosion. That's of course been happening in the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, for the past few months now, ever since that October the 7th attack by Hamas. And we've got other groups obviously in the Middle East also, which have been planning attacks against Israel, and obviously we've seen the kind of international diplomacy efforts from both the US, Britain, and others across the world to try and settle these tensions and try and solve something in some kind of way by possibly achieving a ceasefire, for example, in Gaza, or kind of bringing leaders together to kind of talk out these issues and find out a kind of political solution. Where this kind of recent escalation came from, though, is ultimately the Israeli strike on both, a senior Hezbollah commander in, southern Beirut, and then also, of course, striking and killing a senior, Hamas's political leader in Tehran. And of course, that angered another key power, which, of course, was already looking at potentially striking Israel, that being Iran, of course, Iran leading that proxy network that we've just been speaking about. But ultimately, Iran is also now very much interested in, well, not necessarily interested, but things are starting to seem like they're heading towards a hot conflict between Iran and Israel. And whilst, these two powers have been large enemies of one another and basically been in a Cold War for the last kind of 40 years even, ultimately now things are increasingly starting to look like we're heading towards a hot war. Why this is? Well, obviously that recent strike into Tehran, the capital of Iran, to take out Hamas's political leader, which was a proxy group for, of course, Iran. This was a way to almost, annoy Iran, but also showed kind of Israel's dominance in the region. And that's why, ever since that strike, many have been kind of suspecting an Israeli or an Iranian strike on Israel was, very, very imminent. Ultimately, though, we haven't seen that just yet. Ever since the last kind of barrage of rockets came from Iran and Israel into both one another's territories, we haven't seen anything kind of come from that, despite what many had been expecting. And now, over the past few weeks, the USA specifically has attempted to kind of settle these tensions, but it seems like things have just boiled over. And whilst there isn't a hot war just yet with Israel and Iran, Israel has now kind of begun their kind of preemptive strikes into Lebanon to prevent what was widely being expected to be a massive invasion by Hezbollah into Israel. As just a few weeks ago, we saw literally from Hezbollah, their own kind of media network, where they produced and sent out videos of essentially their military drones over key cities in Israel, basically saying that we're here and we're ready to strike when we want to. And that kind of struck fear obviously into a lot of the Israeli public and of course Israeli military leaders, and that's why we're now of course seeing this kind of response from Israel, it does seem like. We will, of course, keep you updated. This is a massive topic, of course, and we could see massive diplomatic efforts come together, and kind of see the world come together to prevent a regional war over the coming week. Or, of course, we could see the complete opposite of that, where kind of alliances and pacts start to form and a regional war seems to emerge. But of course, as I said, we'll keep you updated and stay on top of this topic as well, just as much as you can by reading the news and keeping online. Basically, if you're looking at certain assets which are of course affected by this conflict, with loads like key commodities, of course, being massively affected by conflicts such as gold and in this case oil as well, with the exchange of fire being the biggest between Israel and Iran since the war back in 2006. It goes without saying, but these strikes have now marked a massive escalation in the hostilities between the two powers and creates a worrying image that the Middle East is heading towards a regional conflict. The tensions between the two powers have steadily been rising over the past 10 months or so since the outbreak of the Israel-Gaza war. Hezbollah is a significant proxy for Iran and holds a large arsenal of weaponry, including long-range missiles, state-of-the-art equipment, and advanced drone tech. Since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Hezbollah has repeatedly tried to represent their power by sending drones and missiles across the Lebanese-Israeli border. Tensions have risen to their peak recently, however, following 2 Israeli airstrikes, one taking out a senior Hezbollah commander and the other killing Hamas's leader. So of course, that's what we spoke about earlier, but that's just some extra context and information for you just there. But as I said, stay on top of this topic and we'll keep you updated as much as we can. That's all to squat on this topic and the topic of the Middle East and tensions over there. Next article is more about the economics, or the kind of economic situation, which of course is just as important a topic, if not more, with the Jackson Hole bankers apparently now pivoting to rate cuts as a soft landing does emerge. Now, those attending the Jackson Hole retreat are now seeming more and more hopeful that they're heading towards that they are close to beating the public's expectations and achieving a soft landing for the global economy. This comes amidst the recent Federal Reserve's retreat to Wyoming, in which they convene with other central bankers from around the world, including the likes of Andrew Bailey, which of course is the governor of the Bank of England, which we're always talking about on this channel. Now, this topic of a soft landing, and rate cuts has been, very, key recently within the kind of sphere of finance and what's going on basically with the Bank of England and the Fed and the ECB, those kind of key central banks that we're always talking about on this channel. And whilst kind of the Bank of England and the ECB had kind of initial worries that they were heading towards recessions, or in fact were in recessions, and therefore had to cut rates even sooner, ultimately the US was in a much harder position because whilst they started to see that they were heading towards a recession, they kind of didn't have inflation at those levels that they needed for rates to be cut, and so they were kind of stuck with this stagflation issue that was seemingly emerging. As if we think back to those recent inflation figures, not the last one but the one before and one before those, all of those were 3% or above, which represents very stubborn inflation, and ultimately is a very worrying kind of picture for the US, with these flies, and is also kind of a very worrying picture for the US as they do kind of head into the election season, and also they just try and emerge out of this kind of post-pandemic economy situation that the whole world is still struggling with, like China, India, and elsewhere around the world. Ultimately, though, it's the recent inflation data, it's the recent employment data, and it's recent other kind of retail sales data actually that has kind of now kind of pushed back on those worries of a hard landing, and is now creating a better picture for central bankers, in which they're kind of looking at the state of the economy and seeing that there's a possibility that they're heading towards a soft landing. Why is this? Well, ultimately retail sales are starting to come out better than previously expected. Employment isn't as worse as as what people kind of previously thought it was coming out at, and of course the most recent inflation figure that we did receive, that we covered on this channel, was of course below that 3% level, and therefore kind of emerging closer or pushing closer towards that 2% target level, which of course is the target for central banks around the world, but also the US, of course. So that's the kind of situation seemingly, and of course this Jackson Hole retreat comes at a very interesting time where all these central bankers are currently faced with a position of cutting rates. Either they they already have started, like with the Bank of England or ECB, or they're about to cut rates like with the Fed, who's expected to cut rates in September. And so you're creating a very interesting situation where they've gone from the period of should we raise rates higher at the last Jackson Hole meeting, or and now it is, should we cut rates immediately for the Fed, or should we continue cutting rates for the Bank of England and ECB? But obviously, stay on top of this topic, and we'll keep you updated as much as we can, with both the Bank of England governor and Fed leader fighting against the fears that growth will need to be sacrificed to reach inflation goals. As both leaders begin to direct their central banks to cutting interest rates, they continue to signal that they are on good course to avoid a recession. A member of Joe Biden's Council of Economic Advisors also told the FT it's likely that the data over the coming months will indicate that there will be a continued low unemployment and continued strength within the economy. Should this soft landing be achieved, central bankers will be celebrated, of course, for their efforts, as many were initially worried that the Fed had basically left it too late to cut interest rates when those last employment numbers did come out, and people kind of started to worry. But that's all to talk about in this article. Very important one indeed, and I hope that kind of gives you a base knowledge of what's going on at Jackson Hole and what could be coming up this week for the Fed and their announcements. That's all to talk about on this article, though. Last article to talk about is actually to do with politics and the US politics, which of course we've been covering as the election race does continue. It has now been reported that Kamala Harris has raised more than $500 million since entering the race for presidency just a few weeks ago. This represents the new optimism and strength within the Democratic Party following the resignation of Biden from the race, with donors and party members now seemingly finding a new passion in the party by being represented by a familiar but new candidate. In the new DNC week alone, she was able to raise around $82 million. Members of the Democratic establishment have also reported there have been an unprecedented level of grassroots donations during the convention week, with reports saying that a third of the donations that were coming in were in fact from first-time contributors. 2/3 of those donors were women and 20% were young voters, which kind of represents what Kamala Harris is reaching out to. But some would of course kind of critique that by saying, ultimately you're reaching out to your Democratic base anyway. That kind of specific group is very unlikely, is far less likely to vote for the Republicans in this case, and therefore if you're just appealing to your base, you're not capturing that kind of center group of voters which actually decides elections, especially in those key swing states. But of course, a very important figure to note nonetheless. During the DNC, during the Democratic National Conference, the party made great efforts to rebrand themselves as the nation's patriotic champion, with the VP saying that helping cast the defeat of Donald Trump on election day would be a country-loving act. So really kind of switching the messaging maybe, and focusing more on the kind of rebranding themselves to being the patriotic alternative to something like the Republicans, which many have argued, of course, have been kind of the unpatriotic group for the accusations of Trump's actions on Jan 6, and of course his kind of other criminal proceedings that are going on, and they're kind of now trying to rebrand themselves as actually the patriotic kind of party here, rather than maybe the self-centered party that the Republicans are. So it's interesting to see how they're kind of trying to paint themselves with this kind of new picture that's emerging for the Democratic Party, as of course Joe Biden has now dropped out, so they kind of are having to create a new image for themselves. And that's seemingly helping, of course, as we've covered previously. That's all to talk about on the articles, though. Next to talk about is, of course, the charts, where some interesting things are, of course, playing out, with the US 30 rising to the upside to start off the week. As of course I am recording this video a little later, as the morning session has somewhat started, as we kind of are just 0.16% up on the day as I record this. And now ultimately over the course of last week, price was rising to the upside, but had stalled out to start off the week up until Wednesday, with price kind of sitting at this key trend line which I did draw out. Now, what then occurred was, of course, Thursday we saw that sell-off from that trend line, which kind of reflected those expectations. But instead of just continuing to the downside, look, we'd seen previously with those reactions to that trend line, we actually found some bullish support down around 40,540, and instead from there we saw price swing to the upside, break above that trend line, and price is now on the upswing as price is broken above those recent highs on the 31st made on the 31st of July, and now they're very much approaching, of course, those highs made on the 18th of July. So definitely keep your eyes on the US 30. Very interesting price action. Next about though is the dollar, which did swing to the downside, ending off last Friday and Thursday after retracing over the course of Wednesday and early morning on Thursday, and declining to start off the week. As of course, if we think back to last week and the week before, price was sitting within this kind of range that we of course have spoken about, but price had of course found kind of an area which price retraced to and then sold off from. As a result, price has now broken below that key liquidity zone, that key double bottom, and basically just swung to the downside the entirety of last week. The question is now, entering the new week, whether price will continue this trend of moving to the downside, or in fact are we expecting now a kind of level of retracement, or kind of are we expecting price to kind of range around some bit, as of course price then finds its feet to kind of prepare for the next move, as it can be uncommon for price to kind of continually move one way for over a week without some kind of retracement or consolidation. But we will have to wait and see, and I think the kind of news that we get from Jackson Hole over this week will be very impactful, of course, for the dollar. So that's the kind of key thing to listen out for, obviously. Next about is Euro USD, which has jumped to the upside to end off last week over the course of Friday, where price was sitting on this key liquidity zone that we'd previously noted, and then utilized that area of liquidity to jump to the upside, and that's why we saw this significant swing up there, up and around the 1.12 level. So the question is whether price will stay above this kind of key liquidity zone which price bounced off from, as that was the kind of all-time high level was made around the 27th of December back in 2023. So we are kind of continuing to make yearly highs, really, year-to-date highs for Euro USD, and now we're kind of in uncharted territory that we haven't seen all the way up and since last year exactly, basically. So the 20th of July 2023. So should price move even higher than that, we're breaking into territory that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. Possibly we haven't seen since 2022. So it's a question of how long we'll see this kind of bullish momentum continue for, and it's whether price will stall out somewhat before moving higher. Next to talk about though is pound yen, which is currently sitting within this range after this massive period of volatility and bearish volume which we experienced from the 11th of July to 5th of August. And as we kind of expected, price is now kind of forming a range as price finds its feet again, pardon me, and ultimately if I just draw out this kind of consolidation area, you can see how price is staying within this range and bouncing up and down within it. So it's a question of whether price will stay within that area or will it break out sometime soon. What kind of price action will we see play out within that zone? So definitely keep price on pound yen. Very interesting indeed. But we're not receiving much pound or yen data this week, so that's something to think about. Yet we are receiving quite a lot of US and Eurozone data. So Euro USD might be the one to be looking at. Next to talk about is Bitcoin, which is broken out of this range, unlike pound yen, and is now on the upside, up and around the $64,000 a Bitcoin mark. The question will be now whether price will retrace back to this area of liquidity, back down to this kind of range before moving higher, and so will price utilize this kind of area to move further to the upside, basically, by using it as a spot of liquidity. And if I draw out that kind of Fibonacci retracement tool, you can see how that does line up with the 3820 along that kind of top end of the range. So definitely keep your eyes on Bitcoin. Next to talk about is gold, which is currently sitting just above the $2,500 an ounce mark, which of course is crazy to think, as gold continues to make more and more newer highs after this kind of period of bullish momentum that we really have seen since the beginning of the year. Ultimately, though, it's the kind of recent price action that we've seen play out between key liquidity zones, which has allowed price to kind of jump higher and higher, with that kind of recent retracement and jump higher that we saw back on the 15th of August from this 38.20 in key liquidity zone that we noted being very significant indeed, and then more recently the kind of retracement back down to this key liquidity zone and resistance level on the 22nd of August, which allowed price to move higher again. And the question will be now whether, because prices utilize that area as an area of liquidity, the price will continue this move higher and break above those recent highs made on the 20th of August. So definitely keep your eyes on gold. Lastly to talk about is oil, which is currently sitting above the $80 a barrel level as a great deal of kind of bullish momentum enters the market as a result of the kind of news that we're hearing from the Middle East about kind of Israeli strikes into Lebanon and Hezbollah strikes into Israel, and so we are kind of waiting to see what does emerge from that. And as a result, people are now pricing people are now pushing the price of oil higher as people expect that to kind of affect the supply of oil from the region. That's all to talk about on the charts. So lastly to talk about is the economic calendar. We're receiving quite a bit of economic data today, so I'll get through it as fast as I can. Firstly, we're receiving the German business climate figure, followed by the US durable goods orders figure and consumer confidence figure. Followed by that, we're receiving the German GDP growth rate figure. So there's the Aussie inflation rate data. Followed by that, we're receiving the German inflation rate and consumer confidence figure, as well as the US and Canadian GDP growth rate figure. Followed by that, we're receiving the Eurozone, French and Italian inflation rate figure. Followed by that, US inflation data and the US consumer sentiment figure. But that's all to note for this week. I hope you have a great trading day and a great trading week. We'll obviously be back here tomorrow, so make sure you tune in for that. But yeah, have a great one. See you later. Bye.